It's important to remember that death in Elden Ring is not a failure. It's an opportunity to learn. That's why the game starts out with an unavoidable death. It's teaching you that death isn't supposed to be a punishment. It's a tool with which you can move forward, get better, and learn from the consequences of your decisions or mistakes. Look, if you're playing this game well, you should know exactly what you did wrong every time you see that "you died" screen and know what you have to do differently next time. Dying will return you to the last site of grace you rested at. Or, a new bonus for Elden Ring, you might be able to choose a stake of Marika instead if one is nearby. You'll be able to tell quickly if you're under the influence of a stake of Marika because there will be a little sort of statue icon just underneath your health, stamina, and FP bars. Any runes you were carrying will be left on the ground at the location of your most recent death, or where you fell from if it was a gravity-induced death. But you will only get one chance to retrieve them before all those runes are lost forever if you die again before getting them back. Okay, with death understood, let's talk about a few other tools and abilities you have at your disposal before we get on to weapons and fighting. For example, in Elden Ring, you can jump. Something that might actually come easier to From Software newcomers than to veterans. Jumping attacks, especially if you're wielding a weapon two-handed, deal tons of super armor damage and so are great for setting up critical hits. However, unlike rolling, jumping has no invincibility frames, so it's actually pretty bad for avoiding enemy attacks unless the attack you're avoiding is specifically a sweeping attack. Not understanding anything I've just said? Don't worry. I'm going to go into all of these topics in a little bit. Stealth is also sort of an option in Elden Ring. Crouching silences your footsteps, enabling you to move without alerting enemies to your presence. Crouching in tall grass obscures enemies' view of you, but be warned, they'll still spot you if they wander too close to your position and they're in direct line of sight. By making use of this type of cover, you can approach your enemies undetected and pick them off with stealthy backstabs, if they're spread out enough. But taking out even one enemy in a group with an insta-kill before revealing your position can be all you need to make a fight go your way. To perform a backstab, by the way, you simply have to be positioned neatly behind an enemy before pressing R1 or RB. It can be a little finicky, especially if you're rushing or stressed, but be aware that you can basically be touching the enemy before you press the attack. Too early and you'll just do a regular light attack instead. When stealthing around though, watch out for enemies carrying trumpets or horns. If they see you, they'll sound an alarm call that'll alert all nearby hostiles to your presence, so make sure and take them out before focusing on anyone else. I've said it before and I will say it again, but rolling is possibly one of the most important abilities to get the hang of in Elden Ring. I covered this briefly in another beginner's tips video, but in case you missed that, the reason rolling is so important to combat in this game is that for a small amount of time during a roll, your character is completely invincible. But this is what people are talking about when they refer to invincibility or iframes. The amount of time you're invincible combined with how fast you roll is dictated by your equip load, which you can check on in your character's status menu. If the weight of your armor, plus any weapons and shields you have equipped, is less than 30% of your overall equip load, you'll do a quick roll, which offers the maximum speed, travel distance, and iframes available in a roll. Anything less than 70% is a medium roll, which also offers decent distance, speed, and protection. You don't really want to be over 70%, as this will offer next to no iframes, and there will be a speed and distance penalty if you try to roll. Now, rolling can be a little bit difficult to get used to, but oftentimes it is a preferable action to staying put or blocking, because not only does it put less of a strain on your stamina than sitting there and taking hits, but it means you can get into a better position during an enemy's attack to immediately follow up with a counter of your own. Managing your tool belt / quick items and your pouch is essential for an easier time with combat. Initially, your tool belt will only contain your sacred flasks, as they're equipped automatically when you get them. However, you can assign most other consumable and reusable items to any of the 10 tool belt slots for more convenient use, and then cycle to them by pressing down on the directional pad and use them by pressing square/X. An important and useful tip: you can always immediately cycle to the item in the first slot by holding down on the D-pad as well. Generally, you probably don't want to keep too many items in here, and you want to switch things out frequently depending on the need or how much you're using things in a certain area. Scarlet Rot negating boluses in Caelid, for example. The game doesn't explain this particularly well, but in addition to your tool belt / quick slot items, you also have a pouch. This provides a few additional item shortcuts and is totally separate from the tool belt. You can access the pouch in the upper right corner of your main menu, where you'll see 6 slots. 4 of these are assigned directional pad inputs corresponding to the 4 directional D-pad buttons, while the others have no associated inputs. To place items in the pouch, highlight a slot and press triangle or Y, and then select the item to place in that slot. To use the item then out in the world, you simply have to hold triangle or Y and then press the directional pad input corresponding to that desired slot. This would be a really good place to put your Spectral Steed Whistle for summoning Torrent, for example. Something you need often, but probably don't want to go cycling through in the middle of a battle. Your survival depends on the quality of your weapons. Though you'll see some increase in attack power from simply leveling up your attributes, which we discussed before in our other Elden Ring for Dummies video, the single most significant boost to your damage output is achieved by upgrading your weapons directly. Upgrading raises their base damage, and it also improves their attribute scaling, which also nets extra damage depending on your character's specialities. Armaments, by which I mean weapons, staffs, seals, shields, anything you equip and use in combat, come in 2 basic types: normal and special. Normal armaments are upgraded using smithing stones to a maximum of +25, and can be fully customized with new weapon arts and affinities. More on these in a little bit. While special armaments are upgraded using somber smithing stones to a maximum of +10, and they have fixed properties which cannot be customized. Think of them kind of as legendary weapons that are sort of part of Elden Ring's lore canon. Special armaments are unique, so they're usually only acquired either by looting sealed areas or defeating tough enemies. Therefore, the somber smithing stones required to reinforce special weapons are a little bit rarer than the standard variety, but because of that, each upgrade level grants special weapons a generally larger boost to base damage and scaling. Just because a weapon is special, however, does not mean that it's better for you. So please don't think that you have to equip a weapon just because it's special or just because it looks good. Essentially, once you've decided what type of character build you want to have or work towards, melee, spell sword, what have you, you'll need to source and choose the right combination of weapons and equipment to implement how you want to play. I mean, it's totally fine to simply pick up a weapon you happen to like using and then decide to upgrade it. But you may want to do a little bit of research and find out if that weapon is worth that long-term investment. Anyway, once you've selected your main weapon, you should prioritize reinforcing it to make sure that you are always dealing as much damage as possible. It's not really a great idea to just scattershot and upgrade a load of weapons once or twice. If you're carrying any upgrade materials that you can't yet buy from merchants or farm from enemies, you should save them for your main weapon and avoid wasting them on other armaments that you're not absolutely certain you're going to use. We're not saying that you should hoard smithing stones or never experiment with other weapons, but just put a bit of thought into what you want to use before you spend what you have. As we mentioned earlier, your weapons can be equipped in either hand, though their functions and movesets can differ to some extent in each case. You can also sheath one weapon or put your shield on your back and use your main weapon in a two-handed stance by holding triangle/Y, and tapping L1/LB or R1/RB. Wielding a weapon two-handed will increase damage dealt by 1.5, and it grants a temporary bonus to strength. Of course, you should only do this when you feel confident about either rolling or generally staying out of the way of an enemy's attacks, because you won't have the benefits of blocking without a shield to hand. Of course, you can also dual wield two weapons as well, and holding a compatible weapon in each hand can unlock dual attack animations that will use both weapons at once. As always, reading the descriptions will let you know which weapons are best for this. Let's talk about affinities. Affinities are the elemental properties and scaling values of an armament, and these decide how much impact each of your character attributes has on the attack power of a particular weapon. Certain affinities also grant a weapon the ability to deal elemental damage or inflict status ailments as well. Standard is your default stat scaling, and it varies by individual weapon. Heavy weapon types enhance strength scaling at the expense of all other types. Quality weapons slightly enhance and more evenly balance strength and dexterity scaling. Keen weapons enhance dexterity or dex scaling, while adding a magic affinity to a weapon weakens its default scaling while adding intelligence scaling, changing the damage to a split physical/magic damage type. Basically, that's good if you're putting points into intelligence when you level up, not so much good otherwise. Fire affinity also weakens default scaling while splitting the weapon's damage between physical and fire damage. Sacred adds faith scaling to a weapon while splitting the damage between physical and holy, great for particularly evil enemies, while lightning does the same but for lightning damage. A poison affinity enhances strength, dexterity, and arcane scaling while adding a poison build-up to attacks. Cold weakens default scaling, enhances intelligence scaling, and adds frostbite build-up to your attacks. Blood affinities add arcane scaling, weakening the weapon's default scaling again, but adding a bleed build-up to attacks. While finally, occult adds arcane scaling, and it prevents the auto-revival of undead enemies, like skeletons. So yeah, this is a lot of info, but all it really boils down to is you should look at what stats you have, what stats you want to build, and see whether the weapon you're carrying is enhanced by those stats. Additionally, is there a weapon you could be using instead for enemies that have a specific weakness? It's really not an exact science, but usually you'll find that humanoid enemies are susceptible to bleed and poison buildup, for example. Beasts can often be weak to fire, and rock or crystal-based enemies take more damage from heavy or blunt weapons, while magic-based enemies will be stronger against magic, but much weaker against physical attacks. One of the really great things about Elden Ring compared to previous From Software games is that it is much more flexible with how you can customize your weapons in order to make full use of affinities and weaknesses. With Ashes of War, not to be confused with Spirit Ashes, more on these in a little bit, you can instantly replace the weapon arts, also known as weapon skills, and affinities of your armaments with new ones. As we already mentioned, you can't do this with special weapons, and not all weapon arts are compatible with every type of armament. However, every Ash of War contains a specific weapon art, usable by pressing L2 or LT, and you can usually see it on the left-hand side of your screen, plus an affinity, which the Ash of War will pass on to any armament onto which it's equipped. A lightning-based Ash of War equipped onto your sword will make your sword do lightning damage, for example. You'll gain the ability to modify your weapons using Ashes of War at a Site of Grace or at a blacksmith's forge when you obtain the whetstone knife from the Gatefront ruins in Limgrave. And your list of available affinities will expand as you acquire upgraded whetstones through the game. You should not ignore Ashes of War, as you'll be leaving a lot of very useful weapon abilities on the table if you do. And you should also pay attention to what affinities your equipped Ash of War is actually imbuing your weapon with. It wouldn't be very useful, for example, to equip a magic-based Ash of War to your weapon if you aren't focusing on actually dealing magical damage or putting points into your intelligence scaling. because a poor intelligence attribute will actually negatively affect the damage output of your weapon. Most of the time, the Ashes of War / weapon skill in your right-hand weapon will become available to use by default. Also remember that some weapon skills on Ashes of War can be doubled up on, as in their full damage potential can be reached with multiple button presses. Or sometimes a weapon skill is passive and you activate it with L2 and then it works for a set amount of time. So, as always, read the descriptions so you fully understand what each weapon is capable of. A final note, an Ash of War can only be equipped on a single armament at a time, but if there's one that you really like and you want to have its effect across multiple weapons or shields, you can trade an item called a Lost Ashes of War for an additional copy of whichever ashes you want. Admittedly confusingly named, but Spirit Ashes are another tool entirely, and another that you'll definitely want to take full advantage of. You should have an item called the Spirit Calling Bell, given to you early in the game by a witch called Rena in the Church of Ella. If you missed that, you can buy it in the Round Table Hold from the Twin Maiden Husks. This item itself is passive, but it allows you to equip reusable items called Spirit Ashes to your tool belt, and summon NPC companions to fight for you by pressing square or X. Spirit Ashes are great for Elden Ring's combat when you're having trouble, because while they generally don't do much damage themselves, they mostly buy you breathing room by taking a boss or an enemy's focus off of solely you and allowing you to attack unhindered, at least for a little while. Bosses will generally turn their attention back to you eventually as the primary damage dealer, and Spirit Ashes don't tend to have a lot of health. So you can't rely on them to solve all of your problems, but they are a big help in boss fights when you're otherwise having trouble. And don't forget, you can upgrade Spirit Ashes in the same way that you can upgrade weapons. Once you've met an NPC called Roderica outside of Stormvale Castle, and completed her questline to send her to the Round Table Hold. Upgrading Spirit Ashes requires runes and either Grave or Ghost Gloveworts, found in crypts and other optional dungeons. You'll usually find a lot of new Spirit Ashes there too, or in lots of other places that are slightly off the beaten path. A little bit on ranged combat. Ranged combat can be a distinct playstyle in Elden Ring, but you'll mostly find it used as a baiting tactic, a backup option, or a way of inflicting a status effect on an enemy before tackling them head-on. Long-range weapons have vastly different effective ranges, stat requirements, and special abilities, with each suited to a slightly different application. And every class of ranged weapons is compatible with unique ammunition. For example, if you want to use a ranged weapon, like a bow or crossbow, you'll need to craft or purchase arrows or bolts respectively. Each type of ammunition has 2 dedicated slots in the equipment tab of the main menu, on the right side of the 2 top rows. In order to fire a ranged weapon, the correct type of ammunition must be equipped in the corresponding slot. With your bow or crossbow drawn, you can fire the ammunition in the first slot by tapping the light attack input for the corresponding hand that it's equipped to. So that's L1/LB or R1/RB. Or the ammunition in the second slot by tapping the heavy attack input for that hand, L2/LT or R2/RT. You'll generally find the recipes for further status-inflicting ammo in cookbooks, and it's worth playing around with these to make full use of a boss's weaknesses. For example, you could use arrows to inflict poison buildup on Flying Dragon Agheel, before charging in to attack them on horseback, so that the poison is quietly doing damage over time, while you're chipping away at the same time with your main weapon. So, realistically, we can't tell you the secret formula on how to fight good in Elden Ring because that really depends on a bunch of factors, including your loadout, your combat style, your modifiers, what exactly you're fighting, and so on. However, here are some general tips that it's worth keeping in mind. First of all, treat your stamina as though it's an extension of your health bar, because in a way, it is. If you're sprinting up to an enemy and spamming attacks until your stamina is depleted, that just leaves you wide open to retaliation once you're done. Good stamina management should always leave you with some left in the tank in case a boss decides to unleash an unexpected attack and you need to roll on out of there or put your shield up for a block. Blocking, of course, absorbs the damage that would otherwise be taking chunks off your health, so make sure you're letting stamina recharge after successful blocks by dropping your shield when it's not in use to allow your stamina to replenish faster. The distance you stay away from your enemy influences the kind of attacks they'll use on you. Sometimes, especially with bigger, tankier bosses, getting as close to them as you can, basically underneath them, may actually be the safest place to attack them from. And spellcasting enemies can tend to unleash their nastiest attacks when you're on the other side of the boss arena. Short of googling an enemy's moveset, and no judgment here if you do, it's just about learning what bosses tend to do in certain situations and reacting accordingly. The solution to every fight isn't always block, hit, drink, flask. I mean, it can be, sure, but you'll be surprised at how often that's actually only making things more difficult for you. On a similar note, while it can be tempting to roll away from scary-looking boss attacks, you may often find that rolling into attacks is actually safer and more beneficial in the long run, as it immediately places you next to them for some punishment. And often, with wide sweeping area of effect attacks, bosses will actually need a couple of seconds of recovery after, in which you just get to pummel away. We mentioned this in another beginner tips video, but if you're wondering what the pattern is to getting an enemy staggered and vulnerable to a critical attack, this is connected to what's called super armor. Basically, everything in the world of Elden Ring, you included, has something called super armor. Think about it as kind of like an invisible stamina meter. Every time an enemy takes a hit, you're reducing their super armor. And when that meter reaches 0, they will be staggered. You'll hear a distinctive booming sound and you can move in to do a critical attack. A particularly powerful attack with its own animation. So each successful hit that you land on an enemy will reduce their super armor by an amount, depending on the type of weapon you're using, whether the attack was one or two-handed, light or heavy, and so on. The trick is, super armor slowly refills when you're not attacking, similar to stamina when it's not in use. Therefore, it's often really important to keep up the attack on a boss if you're trying for critical hits that will end the battle more quickly. If you don't land hits frequently enough, the boss's super armor will recover and you'll just be there trading blows for longer. I mean, sometimes this is necessary. You don't want to get greedy and deplete your stamina, as that will leave you wide open to attacks. And sometimes the wiser course of action is to simply back off and heal instead. A good tip to know, though, is that spells, arrows, darts, and other consumable items also count towards pressing the attack, so it's worth bearing in mind. Locking onto an enemy is usually your friend, but sometimes it isn't. If an enemy is deploying a wide area affecting attack, sometimes the best thing to do is to disengage your lock on so that you can keep an eye on the ground, the air, and everything around you for unexpected danger. Any bosses that spam magic or lava or lightning could fall into this category. Generally though, lock on is super helpful, but of course this can be down to personal player preference. The main tip we offer for Elden Ring combat, though, is to be patient. If you charge into every battle, you will never stay alive long enough to actually learn how an enemy works or what your options are. Dodging and blocking are important in those early stages so that you can simply watch what a boss is doing and look for openings in their attack pattern. Do not get greedy. But the bottom line is, this is not a hack and slash game, so try to think about attacking only when you already know it's going to successfully connect. This video is once again getting quite long. I'm sure you can hear it in my voice, so we may just have to leave it there. But are there any other Elden Ring for Dummies topics we can cover in the future? Some locations maybe, and what order to tackle them in? Leave your suggestions in the comments. Check our other videos for topics not covered here, and as always, keep at it. You've got this. Thanks for watching. Bye.